Let's make the drop stitch sweater using panel mold on my 48 needle circular knitting machine. I was told that this looks like the mermaid sweater, so that's what we will call it, the mermaid jumper. All right, enough of me, and let's get on to making it. A few things that we're going to use is panel mode and tube mode. The button is on the side of your machine if you have the 48 needle Sentro. This is the yarn I'm using. It was a fingerling number 2 weighted yarn by Salty Blonde Fine Fibers. The color is called Oyster Bay. This was a hand-dyed yarn that I got from my local yarn shop. So it was a blend of cashmere, merino, and nylon. Things you're going to need to know to make this sweater is how to do panel mode, the waste yarn cast on, and tube mode. If you do not know how to do those things, do not fret. I have the step-by-step tutorials on how to do panel mode, waste yarn cast on, tube mode, and the waste yarn cast on tube mode in the video description below. For the panel mode, we're going to make 2 panels. In panel mode, you are going to start your panel at the number 3 needle, and however wide you want to make your panel, you want to make sure you do an odd number of needles. I ended up doing an even number of needles, and it doesn't work to pick up the stitches. So that's my tip number 1, is you probably want to go from the 3rd needle up to the 47th needle. I have a video on how to do that linked in the video description below if you want to make the widest panel possible. For your waste yarn, I like to do about 10 rows, and then you're going to add on your project yarn after you do your waste yarn cast on. For my sweater that I made, I did 60 rows, but you can always do more if you would like to make your panel longer, and you're going to make 2 of these panels. Both will start with the waste yarn cast on, and then you can do 60 rows or however rows you want to do. To remove your panel from your machine, I ended up using circular knitting needles for the panels, and after I did this, you don't need to do that. Just do the standard cast off with your long tail yarn that you have of your project yarn and a darting needle. So this first one, I'm going to show you how I pick up every other row to do our drop stitch. Again, I'm using my circular knitting needles, which you definitely can do, but just a darning needle on the end of your tail end of your project yarn will work as well. So the main thing you want to do when you're picking up your loops over those 2 small pegs is you want to always pick up your first needle and your very last needle. So we picked up this first needle here, and now we're going to skip the next needle. We're not going to pick that up because that's one that's going to drop to make our drop stitch. Now you notice after I picked up my first stitch, the second loop just popped right off the machine, which is fine. We want that one to drop, but that's just, you want to be a little bit careful that you don't pull too hard and you pop off more stitches than you want to before you have picked up the ones. So I'm just going to speed this up, and we're going to pick up every other stitch on our machine till our panel is off of the machine. Now at the very end, you're going to see that I pick up the last 2, and that's because I did an even number of needles. If you do an odd number, you don't have to do this, and that's what would be better, because what I ended up doing is I just had to drop 2 needles in a row to make the drop stitch. So I have a little bit wider drop stitch on the side of my panel. And so now we're going to just set this aside, and we're going to make the 2 sleeves on tube mode. And we're going to do, again, the waste yarn cast on like normal and crank out our tube. Again, I do about 10 rows or so for my waste yarn cast on. Then I add on my project yarn, and for my sleeves, I did 50 rows. Now here's what's easier. Just have a long tail of your project yarn, put on a darning needle or a large eye. Sometimes they're plastic, mine is metal. And then we're going to pick up every other needle just like we did for the panel. We're going to pick up every other stitch till we're all the way around. So I'll keep this in real time for just a little bit so you can see how I'm doing every other needle. And the one thing you do want is a very long tail, because for the most part, this is going to stay on your machine and the fabric is stretched out. And until you take it off, you're going to need a lot of waste yarn. If it ends up being too short, you can just tie some extra yarn on the end of your tail to give you a little bit more, because you're just pretty much needing it to a bulk of the yarn just to get it off of the machine, and then you can cinch it down a little bit. So now that you can see, I'm just picking up every other one till I get to the end. I'm going to speed this up. And you're going to want to make 2 tubes so you have 2 sleeves for your sweater. Once we have both of the sleeves done and off of the machine, now I'll show you how we're going to secure the end stitches where our waist yarn is. We need to do this on our 2 sleeves and on the 2 panels for our torso or for the body of our sweater. So I have a large eye needle on the end of the tail of my project yarn. And if you can see here, there is a row of yellow yarn, and sandwiched in between that row of yellow is our first row of our green yarn, which is the first row of our project. And we're going to pick up every single loop all the way around. And what this is doing is securing the stitches. If we did not do this and we remove the waist yarn, then our project would unravel. So what this is doing is locking in place these stitches. So what this is called is they bind off. We're binding off the stitches so they cannot unravel. This is a very simplified, easy version on how to do a bind off. If you know how to hand knit, you could hand knit an edging, or you could also crochet an edging as well if you wanted to do that. But we're just doing the very simple version, and you could add an edging if you wanted to, or a ribbing. But for this, to make it kind of that mermaid jumper, a real flowy look, we're just going to bind it off this way to make it very simple, but also very flowy. I also wanted to make this tutorial very beginner friendly as well. So we're just going to do a very simple, easy bind off that hopefully everybody's able to do. So I'm just going to speed this up till we get to the end. And then once we have every single stitch bind off, before you remove the waist yarn, I'll show you how to do that. Make sure you have every single stitch picked up. Now to remove the waist yarn, take the tail end of your waist yarn that's connected to your project yarn, and you are going to just pull out those little loops like this, and it's going to unlock it from the stitches of our project yarn. And I like doing it this way because you're only having to unravel this part instead of all 10 rows that you did. You can also do a ravel cord cast on. I have that in my page here on how to do that. But again, we wanted to make something very easy and simple, so we're just going to do it this way. So just take your time and you can take out the waist yarn, but you can see when I do that, it comes free from the waist yarn and our project stitches are all locked into place and they do not drop or unravel. And that's what we want to see. And then once you kind of get this going, you can do a few stitches at a time by pulling on a loop and taking out the thread like this. And so I'm going to do a few more in real time just so you can see how you can get it removed easily from your project. And then I will speed it up. And then we're going to do the same process on our panels. So I have the yarn all done and it's off. And now it's just removed from our tube. So at this point, we can drop our stitches as well, which is the most satisfying and fun part of all of this. So we're going to start at the top where we did our every other cast off, where we picked up every other row or every other stitch, and you're going to start lightly pulling. You don't want to pull too much because you don't want to take off that yarn and start dropping more stitches than you want. Every other one should drop. And so we're just going to go all the way around the tube and kind of lightly pull to get every row started. And then once we're all the way around, then you can do the really fun pull and you'll drop a ton of stitches all at once. And I'll show you how that's done. The thinner the yarn, like I'm using here, the little bit more delicate of a process this is. The thicker the yarn, it's a little bit easier to do. So now that I have all of them started, now I can just take the end and I can start pulling in big chunks. And I will say the tubes are a lot easier to drop than the panels. So we'll get it dropped all the way down to the bottom. And our sleeve is done, and you'll want to do this exact same process on your other sleeve. And now we're going to go to our 2 panels and do the same thing. So now first what we want to do is we get our 2 panels. Here's my first one, and you can see how it can start to drop from the top. So you just need to be careful that you don't remove either your yarn that you use to cast off, that it doesn't come out of those loops, or since I use my circular knitting machines or circular knitting needles at this point, you just want to make sure those loops don't fall off the needle. But we need to bind off our bottom stitches just like we did on our tube so we can remove the waste yarn cast on. And it's the same process. We're going to take our darning needle with the tail end of our yarn that is hooked on to our project yarn. I'll zoom in here so you can see this. And again, you see the 2 rows of yellow stitches, and sandwiched in between there is a row of green stitches. And that first row of green stitches is what we want to pick up. Again, and so this is called the bind off, and we're just doing a very simple, easy bind off. You could also hand crochet a bind off by picking up these loops and do like a ribbing or an edging. You could also hand knit a bind off as well if you know how to do that. But we're just going to do something very simple by taking our needle and picking up each of these stitches. Again, you want to make sure you pick up every single one, so when we remove our waste yarn off of the project yarn, we don't want our project yarn to unravel. So that's why it's really important when you do your waste yarn cast on is that it's in a contrasting color, so you can easily identify what's your project yarn and what's the waste yarn. A few reasons why I like to do the waste yarn cast on instead of just a standard cast on is it helps pick up any of the slack from the first few rows. Usually the tension's a bit looser, so the waste yarn picks that up and kind of evens out the tension. And then when we go to add on our project yarn, the tension is all the same. Also, you can see at the end of the waste yarn, it kind of curls. So it also takes up that curl. So it's a lot easier to bind off as well. So I'm going to speed this up and I'll meet you down at the end. And then once we get all these bind off, the very last one, that's kind of the little bit of a tricky one that you just want to take your time to make sure that you get, and that you have every single stitch done. And there's one kind of little one that's possibly hiding in there. You can see him here. So I'm just right inside that little piece of yellow. So I'm just going to pick him up just in case, because we don't want our project to unravel or drop. Now that everything is bound off, now we can remove the waste yarn, and we're going to do it the same way like we did the tube. Go to the tail end of the waste yarn, and we're just going to start to kind of de-knit it by pulling on that tail end, and you're going to see it come out and come off of our project yarn. Just like this. And once after I get about 4 or 5 of them done, then you can take kind of 3 or 4 loops at a time and pull them out. But for the first few, I do them individually. This also just kind of gives you a nice visual of the process, but you can do a few more at a time as well. All right, so I'm going to speed this up, taking off all of our waste yarn, and then sometimes it kind of helps you can use your darning needle to get those loops out. If you're having trouble picking them up with your fingers or if you don't have long fingernails. And then I will stop it here. I'll just show you at the end, this little one, this last little loop, it can get caught. And so you just kind of need to take your time with him to get that last one out. It's just kind of tight. And so I kind of use my darning needle here to pick it out away from the project yarn. And it's just a little bit fiddly how it loops around, but once you kind of get it, then it will come off your machine. And if needed, this one was a little bit more stuck than my other panel, so you can take some scissors if you need to and cut this loop. It was just kind of locked up in with my project yarn. Just be careful that you do not cut your project yarn. If you do, try to cut out your waste yarn, which is I try to avoid, but I had to do it there. It was just kind of stuck in the fibers. So now that our waste yarn is removed, now we can drop our stitches. I had it started a little bit just showing you the biggest ones that are going to be hard to drop is the second to last one. Remember, our first and our last stitch we want picked up to have on, mine's on my crochet or my knitting needles here, but you want it, you don't want the first and last stitch to unravel, or else it'll unravel your whole project. But that second one in, that one's just going to be the hardest one to unravel. You kind of have to help that one out the most. But we're just going to stretch this down. I'll speed this up. And once we get all the stitches dropped, that's when I realized, I don't know why I use my circular knitting needles to take it off the machine, because I'm just going to put the tail end of my yarn on the darning needle, and I'm going to transfer all of those loops back on to the yarn with my darning needle. So saving you a step here by just doing the normal cast off. So I'll speed this part up. And if you did do your circular knitting needles to cast off and now you're putting it onto the yarn like this, just be careful you don't drop any of those stitches. And now our panel's done, and you want to do the exact same thing to your other panel, and I'll meet you back here when it's done. All right, now we have both of our panels done. Now we're going to start constructing our jumper or our sweater by pretty much sewing it together. It's kind of like a very loose mattress stitch that we're going to do. And we're going to take that long tail end yarn that we had when we cast it off, and we're going to use that to sew up the side of our two panels. Now, if you didn't leave a long enough piece of yarn to sew up, you can always just tie on another piece of yarn from your waste yarn at the end and then sew it together. So to sew it together, we want to put right sides together and wrong side facing out. So whatever you want your inside of your sweater to be facing out towards you as we sew it together. So when we flip it right side out, your seam is on the inside, because there will be a little bit of a seam. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting right sides together, wrong side facing out. I'm lining up my edges, and then I ended up taking the two little tail pieces and just doing a quick little handover knot just to kind of line up those corners. And that kind of helps out a lot. Because it's kind of a very delicate fabric that we're working with, and it's curling on those sides. So now we're going to take our darning needle and we're going to hold up the two outer edges together. And I'm using my left hand for this, and then with my right hand, I'm sewing back and forth pretty much between the 4 rows of yarn that you have. So the most outer pieces, going back and forth. I'm not doing a whip stitch where you go over and over and over. I'm going back and forth, and that seemed to create a nicer edge for the panels. Now, also, this fabric was very silky and slick on my countertop. So after I did a few of these back and forth, and you just kind of have to take your time because those edges curl. So you kind of hold it up and uncurl them while you do your seam back and forth. What helped is going onto my sofa, because the yarn kind of clung to the fabric of my sofa, and it made it a little bit easier to see, since it's kind of this net mesh stitch that we have made with our drop stitch, and it made it a lot easier to finish sewing this up. So that's why I'm showing you here a nice little tip. If it's too silky, too where it's hard to find that edge because it's curling, try laying it out on your sofa like this, or on a fabric surface to kind of hold it taut for you, and then you can do your seam. And you're going to sew it back and forth all the way up, but leaving an opening for your armhole. And I will speed that up and I'll show you when I get to that point. So I'm going to finish sewing back and forth. This actually feels like it takes longer than making the tubes actually, and the panels. So once we sew all the way up, I'm going to leave an opening for my armhole like this. And you can see I have the top corners just with a quick little handover knot. We're going to make an armhole like that. So I will meet you back here once we get to that point. Okay, so I've gone up as far as I believe I want to, and I'm just going to leave this long tail end. I have not knotted it down, because if you need to add more or subtract it to make your armhole larger or smaller, you can do that once you try it on. Now we just need to connect the top 2 corners and sew down a little bit for our armhole. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now, once you have those top part connected and we have our seam here, this is the right side facing out. Now we want to put them over in half again. So now right sides are facing together, wrong sides are facing out, and we're going to sew up our other seam about to the same spot on the top and bottom, leaving an opening for our armhole like we did on this side. Again, I leave the long tail ends loose because after you get this other side sewn up, then you can try it on and see if you need to sew up a little bit more or if you need to remove some of your stitches to make the armhole wider. So here it is. After doing my armhole on both sides, again, I still have these long tails hanging out here just in case I need to add or subtract any more to make those armholes the right size for me. So at this point, you want to try it on. And so here's what it looks like. And I think it makes a really cute tank. So if you want to stop at this point and just make an adorable little tank, you can do that. So here's how that is. Everything looks good. I don't need to add any more. My armholes were a good size. So now we can move on to adding our sleeves. When we go to add on sleeves, it's going to make a drop sleeve. So even though we sewed up a little bit, the two corners where they meet for the top of our two panels here, we need to also sew across a little bit to make a neck hole opening, because if you don't and you just tie on the sleeves, it's going to pull the sleeve down too much and it will come off your shoulder. So we need to give it some support up here and leave an opening for your neck hole. So I'm going to do that with the remainder of my yarn that I have here. This other side, I don't have any long tails, so I'm just going to tie on a new piece of yarn onto this side with a little knot. So that's what I'm doing here. I have my darning needle and I'm doing the same thing like we did for our side seams. I have this is the wrong side facing out, so our shirt is inside out at this point, and I am making this upper seam, leaving an opening for a neck hole. And I do the same things that I did for the armhole. Once I get it over enough where I think it's about where I want it, I stop, I leave this long tail. I'm going to sew up the other side, and then I'm going to put it on again to see how it feels on me, if I need to sew up more or not. And then I don't actually tie these down until after I have the sleeves on, just to make sure everything's fitting the way I want once the sleeves on, because that's adding some weight to this point on top of your shoulders where your neckline is. And so once I have the sleeves on, then I could see if I needed to add any more stitches or remove any as well. So at this point, I'm going to speed this up and I will meet you back once the two sides are sewn up for our neck hole. And then here I am lining up the two corners on the other side, and I'm sewing up the other side of our shoulder to our neck hole here. All right, now that our neck hole is sewed up on both sides, this is how your shirt or sweater should be starting to take shape and should look something like this. Now it's time to add on our sleeves. So we're going to take one of our tubes for our sleeves, and you can choose which side of the tube you would like to attach to your body, right where you have the armhole there. So I'm going to take the side that has the longest piece of yarn. For me, that's made that decision easy, so I don't have to tie on a new piece of yarn. And then since we dropped the stitches, it's very loose. So at some points of this, I like to start at the bottom of the armpit and sew it around in a circle. But because it's very loose on the edge, you sometimes might have to gather on the sleeve a few of the stitches so it fits right onto the body where the armhole is of your sweater. So this just took a little bit of trial and error, but we're going to do the same type of stitch that we did. It's kind of like a very loose back and forth stitch that we're going to sew up, almost kind of like a mattress stitch, but with a seam. And we're going to sew this around. What makes it really nice is after you put this on, you can see I'm starting here at the bottom point of the armhole where your armpit is, that's where I'm going to connect the two and start up and around. It's really easy to take out these stitches if you need to kind of redo it a little bit so you're gathering in the right spot so you don't have any puckering. That's the only thing you kind of just need to take your time on. So here I am, I'm going to speed it up slightly, going back and forth so you can see the process, then I'll speed it up more. But you're going to sew on your one sleeve on this side. Once this one's done, you're going to sew your sleeve onto the other side. And you do it the same exact way, just stitching back and forth. You want to make sure you're starting on the wrong side is facing out, so your seam will be on your inside of your project when you flip it right side out. And so we're just going to stitch this around. And again, I think the whole process of just stitching this together takes longer than making the tubes or the panels. Now, once you have everything stitched together, you want to try it on one more time to see if you need to sew up a little bit more on your neck holes or anything. If not, then at that point you can tie off any of your loose tail ends of your yarn. I tied them in a knot a few times and then I cut off the tail ends. For your sleeves, you can let them stay really loose at the end, or you do have some extra yarn. You can pull it a little bit and tighten it up and then tie it off. And here's the finished product with everything tied off. Here's how it looks on me. And it creates a very cute mermaid looking jumper. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you everybody for all your support, likes, and follows. And I hope you enjoy making this project. Happy crafting, everybody.